Okay, welcome to Living Eternity Now. Today we're going to analyze in some detail what is the origin of the problem that we are experiencing in the world today. This phenomenon worldwide where everything is out of order, imbalanced. How can you perceive, how can you solve a problem of which you are unaware? If you perceive the origin of the problem, then all things become solvable. And so let's look at a couple of examples that will help us to perceive what's going on in the world. In the 1970s, the economy of the United States was in trouble. When Reagan took office in 1980, the real workforce of the nation, our agriculture, industry, the services that we do for each other, the workforce in general, was faltering at all levels. When an economy is faltering, this is a symptom of something else that's going on, because economy is the result of a civilization. It's not the basis of civilization, as is this mentality that we have, money is everything. A faltering economy shows that something else at the origin needs to be treated. And if you treat that origin, then the symptoms get solved. And this is not the first time that we've had problems in the United States of this nature. Imagine in the 1930s, the Great Depression. For 10 years, people were out of work. The situation was dire as a result of the 1929, this famous stock market crash. So how did the United States recover from the Great Depression? The president at that time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he launched something that was amazing. He didn't stimulate the speculative market, which caused this problem. When the speculative market is much greater than the workforce, if the workforce, the real economy, is going down and the speculative market is going up and up and up, what happens is there's nothing here sufficient to support the speculative market. So then everything collapses, everything comes down, and everybody suffers. This is what happened in 1929. This is what happens with all stock market crashes. Now, what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in the 30s, he launched what was called the New Deal. They were 43 different federal programs producing thousands of projects aimed at activating human resources, especially unemployment. They were aimed at giving people work. And at that time, the men in these projects, they earned $1 a day, which at that time had a certain force that it doesn't anymore. It was low paid, but what was the philosophy behind this? If you give money directly to people, okay, their physical existence is helped, but what about their spirit? The idea of giving people work is to give them dignity, to put them into good action. If you know something about metaphysics, about ontology, the study of being, the essence of being is action, good action. When you put somebody into a good action, their spirit grows, and then everything around that develops. You can see this in people who are completely stopped. They become depressed. They can't think clearly anymore because the being is meant to be in action. And so just to have an idea, for example, this New Deal, the programs were called the Work Progress Administration, which literally built America. The United States was built during a time when there was no money. How did that happen? It's a proof that a nation is built, our lives are built on work, and the money comes as a result. So during a time when there was no money in the United States, literally the infrastructure of modern America was built, including, look at this, 572,000 miles of rural roads were built in the 30s during the Great Depression. 67,000 miles of urban streets. 122,000 bridges were built and 1,000 tunnels. during this time when there was no money, but putting people in action, in good action. There were 1,050 airfields and 4,000 airport buildings. This federal project of men working, it also constructed 500 water treatment plants, 24,000 miles of sewers and storm drains, 36,900 schools were built, 2,552 hospitals, 2,700 firehouses, and nearly 20,000 county, state, and local government buildings. And some of these more famous ones that we take for granted nowadays, the Tri-Borough Bridge and the Lincoln Tunnel in New York. I don't know how they made the Lincoln Tunnel underwater, but it was done. The Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State, the longest continuous sidewalk in the world along 6.5 miles of Bayshore Boulevard in Tampa, Florida. The overseas highway connecting Key West, Florida to the main island. Also the electrified Pennsylvania Railroad between New York and Washington State, et cetera, et cetera. There were all kinds of things were built during the Great Depression. Also, something I find very interesting is that this program, the Work Progress Administration, it also supported tens of thousands of artists by funding the creation of 2,566 murals, 17,744 pieces of sculpture that decorate public buildings nationwide. And the federal art, theater, music, and writing programs brought more art to more Americans than ever before or since. And this program, it led to the creation of the National Foundation for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In fact, all of these programs, what happened was gradually, they didn't exactly liquidate, they turned into private companies so that the men who, for example, were working on these roads, they continued to work on these roads in the form of private companies. They began as federal programs and turned into companies afterwards. And this greatly revitalized the market situation, the economy, the real economy, the working economy. It was ingenious what Roosevelt did at this time to rectify the situation, the depression, the economy, which had collapsed because of the stock market. There was another program launched called the Civilian Conservation Corps program. And in less than 10 years, they planted nearly 3 billion trees and built 800 parks across the country, among many other works achieved by this program. So what we notice clearly is that what creates a nation, what builds our lives, is not money, it's work, good action. Work in benefit of others, working to benefit our communities, the society, the nation, our neighbors. This Christian orientation of working in benefit of others. This builds a real civilization. Now, in stark contrast, in the 80s, during the administration of Ronald Reagan, there was launched what was called Reaganomics. It was not something that Reagan produced. He didn't know anything about economics. This was using the ideas of the atheist economist, Milton Friedman, that if we're having problems in the economy, just print more money. Had this very superficial idea, completely out of reality. Just print more money. This devaluates the currency. If the currency is not backed by gold or silver, then it's backed by the workforce. And if it's not being backed by the workforce, then it has no backing. It actually becomes useless. And what Reaganomics did was to greatly stimulate the stock market. Instead of looking at what's the real problem that's going on that needs to be treated, the stock market was stimulated at all levels, personal levels, individual levels, company levels, industrial levels. So people became more interested in earning money in the stock market rather than what they were producing. So this greatly escalated the real problem, because the real problem was not being treated, it was being substituted with money. So this creates a certain decay in the quality of the items and in the productivity. Do you perceive? And we get induced into thinking that everything is great because money is flowing, we have money. It's kind of like a car spinning the wheels in the snow. You're actually digging a hole in the ground, but the car is not moving. Yes, there's money, money's coming in, money's all over, but this civilization is going down because the real problem is not being treated. In fact, it's getting worse. Tragically, the overall effect of Reaganomics was to deactivate the American people and, in a certain way, bring them under control, because being everything linked to money, who controls the issuance and the regulations of money, the issuance of money? If we're linked so much to money, then they control our lives. But the principal point here is that Americans were deactivated because they're only after money now and not after how they can improve their work, their contribution to society, what they do in benefit of others. No, it's just making money with money, just money. You know, this money speculation, it's immoral because you don't give to society something in return for the money that you earn. You're just making money with money. You're just taking from society. And so this immoral action of not benefiting anybody, just trying to benefit yourself only, this sickens the soul of society. In more recent times, we see in the Obama administration, for example, there was another crash of the economy. And so these same bankers, they took untold trillions of bailout dollars from American taxpayers, took it for themselves, in the pretense to kickstart the economy. Of course, this never happened. Why do they do this? They took all of this money for themselves from government resources to make sure that nothing like the New Deal treating the real problem would take place. Take all the money for themselves, these international bankers and these economically powerful people, the petroleum and electricity magnates. They take this money for themselves, enrich themselves, and then leave the rest of the people wanting. So you see, this path toward inactivity, deactivating what used to be, Americans used to have this altruistic philosophy of life, to do the best, to be the best, to do the best that you can in the service that you do. They were very active. In the past, the American people were the most active people in the world. That's why we had the greatest economy in the world. But this path toward inactivity and immorality that Reaganomics induced was the single most tragic turn in the history of the American people. Can you see that? Do you perceive this now? During the Reagan administration, there was also a deregulation of the policies of the journalism fairness doctrine, which was deregulated so that the media can easily go into the hands of the economically powerful. Also, during the Reagan administration, they set into motion the overturning of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which was to regulate the bankers. And this began a series of banking deregulations in order to facilitate these bankers taking the wealth of the nations to themselves. As Reagan himself declared, we're going to set the bull loose, the bull representing Wall Street and these speculators. So he put American society in the hands of the worst people on the planet. Reagan was perfect in their hands because he was a professional Hollywood actor who just wanted fame and glory and money for himself. He sold himself out to the evilest of men. And some of you may remember in 2011, there was an international movement against these economically powerful people. It was called Occupy, where there was around a 5 to 6 month constant protesting, not in front of the White House, in front of Wall Street, demonstrating against these speculators, these economically powerful people, conscientizing people, the fact that these economically powerful people even dominate the political sector. So our politicians end up serving the powerful instead of representing the people. And this has become very dangerous. So I was there at this movement. It was mostly centralized in New York, even though it was a nationwide protesting against what these powerful people do with us. And at that time, I had produced a television program that I would like to play for you now, at least in part, because these are universal truths. And I was just looking at it recently, and I find that this is more pertinent to our situation today than it was in 2011. So I'm going to run this for you now, and enjoy.
Power to the people. Power to the people. Power to the people. Power to the people.
Welcome to Analyzing the 1%. My name is Gilbert Gambucci. Using the science of analytical trilogy, which is a science which considers science, philosophy, and spirituality in our analysis, I would like to analyze today the pathology that is inherent in the structure of capitalism, in the structure of Marxism, and also in anarchism. Because what we need to perceive a little bit better, perhaps, is that the type of democracy that our founding fathers set up for us, fought for and set up, has been the best type of democracy in all of modern history. And we need to return to that. We need to learn better what were the principles of our founding fathers. So that the objective is not to replace the democracy that we have, which is not functioning at the moment. Why? Because it's being dominated. It's no longer upheld or protected. It's being dominated by the economic sector, by the economically powerful people, the 1% as we call them. And we're not talking about wealthy or very wealthy people. We're talking about a group of 300 families or so, these international bankers, together with some of them are industrialists, who are determined to enslave humanity. They're very well organized and very dangerous to society. So I would like to just take a quick look at capitalism, because we see that in its very structure, it is exploitative. Okay, what happens is that all of the wealth of the nation is being siphoned up to a few, and the many receive relatively nothing in comparison to the wealth that the capitalists extract for themselves. And you know what? In Marxism, it's the same problem. Marx was very naive to this question of the pathology of those who wield power. And so what happened was, even though Marx made an incisive critique of capitalism, he ended up putting things in the hands of the state. So what happens in practice in Marxism is that the state, the politicians, have everything, and the people in general have relatively nothing. So the results is the same. Capitalism and Marxism have the same results in the end. And in anarchism, it's good for us to see what is the pathology of this so-called non-hierarchical direct democracy. Because in anarchism, they do try to avoid the pathology of people from getting into power and then wielding power in an erroneous way. But in reality, there is a place for leaders who serve the public. You know, this type of They are rarer, but they exist. Leaders are a natural thing. What we need to do is be able to perceive when somebody wants power for pathological reasons. This, we need to sharpen our awareness of this. And you know, one of the great things about Americans is that we put things in practice. You know, even in Wall Street, we have tried out this direct democracy type of thing. And there are many intellectuals who have written books about it. But what happens is that when everyone has an equal say, whether they really know what they're talking about through experience, whether they more or less know what they're talking about, or whether they are completely out of reality or disruptive, bad intentioned, when each one has an equal say, what happens is that the bad intention, those who are disruptive, take over the situation. And we've seen this in many of our General Assembly meetings, so we know from experience that this direct democracy, at least in a large scale, it doesn't work. You have to learn how to control the most pathological individuals so that everyone can benefit from a democratic way of operating. And you know, it was exactly our founding fathers who analyzed that very well, how to set up a democracy. The problem is today, however, it's not being upheld. No one is protecting our Constitution, our constitutional rights. And so that's why we have these demonstrations going on in the occupations, nationwide and all over the world. And, you know, in the second program, I did a study of Thomas Paine, for example, who was showing the need for there not to be people in power continuously. You know, in his day, it was the king. In our day, it's the economically powerful people. They're all the time there. They were showing that you can't have that. It turns into despotism right away. You know, so we need to see the principles of our founding fathers. In program number 4, we were looking a little bit at Thomas Jefferson, the concerns he had about the educational system and the public media, how they need to be free. You know, they can't be owned by the 1%. That's anti-American. All right? So we need to return to the principles of our founding fathers and the Constitution of the United States. And I would like to take a look, I have a short video clip of some of the occupiers of Wall Street explaining what is this group called ALEC. That is the American Legislative Exchange Council, a very dangerous organization. And I'll let the occupiers themselves explain this to us. It's a very good consciousness to have, to see one of the ways in which the economically powerful people dominate our democracy, and as a result, our constitutional rights. Do we have that video clip ready? Let's roll this about ALEC.
Who is ALEC? The American Legislative Exchange Council.
This is a protest against the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, which is basically an association of corporations and politicians that draft model cookie-cutter legislation in the interest of the profits of these corporations, and then try to get legislators around the country to implement it into law at a state level.
So we didn't know a ton about how this organization worked until recently, when about, I think it was 700 or 800 documents were leaked by a disgruntled former ALEC member. But we have since found out through these documents that they have been involved in things like the anti-immigration bill in Arizona, the union-busting efforts in Wisconsin, and Governor Scott Walker was part of ALEC before he became governor, and a lot of the sort of new laws that allow for private prisons. So ALEC is sort of like this big shadowy force financed by the biggest corporations in the country that are essentially writing our laws.
What we're trying to emphasize is the fact that behind the scenes, the rationale for a lot of these laws come from corporations who want to profit on them. So,
And Koch brothers.
Koch Industries is one of the most prominent members, and people vote on their politicians but don't realize that so much of what they do is not something that they just sort of dreamed up in their office by themselves, but are based on their connection with these corporations.
Yeah.
And so we're here today to say, listen, we don't think that that's right. We don't think that there should be so much corporate influence in our political process. And we're also here to sort of draw attention to the fact that Bank of America received unprecedented amounts of government backing and government support and loans from the Fed at almost a 0% interest rate, and then went right back to paying themselves big fat bonuses.
Hey, hey, ho, ho. Corporate greed has got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho. Corporate greed has got to go.
Any other kind of industry, if this was a car company, if this were a health insurance company, all these guys would be in jail. They would be doing time for this kind of fraud. If you went out and you sold a bunch of defective cars that caused people to have accidents, people would go to jail for that. But nobody is going to jail in companies like Bank of America, and they should. So Bank of America is a totally appropriate target for Occupy Wall Street. It's a company that's barely hanging on. The only reason it's staying in business is because the market thinks that the government is going to rescue it if it goes under. We have to make sure that enough pressure is put on the government so that nobody ever rescues companies like this again, that they can't engage in this kind of fraud and get away with it.
Hey, hey, ho, ho. Corporate greed has got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho. Corporate greed has got to go.
You know, the late great President John F. Kennedy, he noticed this discrepancy between democracy and capitalism. Look, I have a quote of Kennedy. You know, the powerful, the 1%, they're very afraid of Kennedy, even until today. They're all the time denouncing his life and his personal things so that people don't perceive better what Kennedy was about doing. For example, here's a quote. "There is no place in democratic life for institutions which benefit the few while denying the need of the many." You see, so Kennedy perceived that capitalism is different from democracy. And in fact, what has happened is that the economically powerful, they have risen up through this field of economics to the point where they're much, much more powerful than the United States government. So they dominate our political sector completely. To the point where we see the political races, they're a joke of democracy. It's just a show in order for some people a certain percentage of the population to remain alienated, as though democracy is well and living, you know. But it's not that way at all. And one of the ways in which we see the 1% attacks, for example, peaceful demonstrators. You know, we have a constitutional right to peaceful protest in order to bring consciousness of things that need to change, in order for us to be able to improve our democracy, which is not working nowadays not because of the structure itself, the democratic structure that our founding fathers left to us, but because it is being completely shut down and overrun by the economically powerful. So, we in the streets, we are demonstrating in the philosophy and spirit of Martin Luther King. That is, we are committed to nonviolent demonstrations to bring consciousness to people as to what's really going on. And the 1%, they attack that consciousness. Now, they are using the NYPD, the New York Police Department, to do that. And there are many in the police department who are in a kind of turmoil because they agree with the occupiers' rights to peaceful demonstration. So we're calling on all New Yorkers to help support those inside the New York Police Department, those who, how could I say, they want to exercise their civil human rights to not recognize orders that are unconstitutional, that are even illegal, aside from the fact of being immoral. You know, there are police who don't want to attack the occupiers, and so they need a help because apparently there are stiff penalties if they go public in relation to this question. They can lose their pensions, lose their job, and so they don't quite have the commitment, the courage, the fortitude that the occupiers have in relation to demanding our constitutional rights back. So they need a kind of help from the community in general, New Yorkers, to help them to simply not obey orders that they are given to attack peaceful demonstrators. So their orders are anti-constitutional, immoral, and even illegal. So they need this help because they're using the NYPD in order to attack our democracy. All right? So I have a little video clip of Norberto Kepi. He's the author of The Science That I Use in Analyzing the Essence of the Problems that we are facing, this science that we call analytical trilogy. And he's analyzing the difference between market economy and the real economy. This is very interesting. Let's take a look at this. Norberto Kepi.
The United States used to produce 50% of the world's production. A fortune flowed into that country every year that really stimulated the GDP, which is the economy of each country. Then, through the use of the stock market, Reagan introduced a complete money speculation system in order to protect the thieves, that is, those who play the stock market without working. So, with a complete crash of the stock market, let's see what would happen.
A stock market crash marks the end of the envious and greedy people.
For those who live off of what others produce, in this case, the money in the stock markets that are produced by others, people who do this are very ill indeed. They are envious, greedy individuals. As Claudius said, it's now termed a disease, a term that many economists are using to describe what is happening in the world, that this type of conduct is a disease.
We have a disease here. Exactly. A social disease, an economic disease. Society is ill. Finally, the world is waking up.
Now, let's see the next one, number 3.
A crash of the stock market is a return to the true reality, which is work.
You can see clearly that people have a lot of respect for those with money. The people think that the rich are the ones who provide the means for everyone to live, when actually it's the people that make it possible for the rich to make money. It's the opposite of what is generally thought. Who is of real value is the people, not those with money who just pass along some crumbs like minimum wage. What is that, minimum wage? Money was made for all human beings because the wealth of humanity is money. Let's see this sentence that clarifies something about Wall Street.
We need to preserve Main Street, which is productive activity, not Wall Street, which is the financial market.
The market economy isn't the real economy, you see. The market must be subordinate to the economy, and not this thing of creating an economy of the market. That's totally different. The stock market is a desire to build an economy based on speculation instead of productivity. It's based on what is extracted from the stock market. That's why I wrote another book explaining this problem.
Liberation of the people.
Let's see, it's here. Liberation of the people. I wrote it there in the United States to incentivize, to encourage the Americans to return to work, to go back to industrialization, to agriculture, to real production. By the way, I've just written a book entitled Slavery and Freedom. This book was released last week, and it has as its objective to show us how we can free ourselves from slavery, from the pathology of the powerful ones, from the laws they create that are destroying all the nations of the earth.
You know, finally, people are realizing that the 1% are a group of completely incompetent individuals. They're very bad intentioned toward humanity, and in fact, they are psychologically severely imbalanced. To categorize them scientifically, they are psychopaths. And a psychopath who acts on society is a sociopath. They're very dangerous for society. And if you would like to have a copy of this book that Dr. Kepi was speaking about, Liberation of the People, you can download it for free at this site, www.healingthroughconsciousness.com. You can download it at this site, or you can order the book if you like. And just not too long ago, people admired the economically powerful, which shows a kind of involvement that we have, that we would like to do the same. If we were in the same position, we would like to be able to get money without working, be wealthy, and just live off the riches of the land without contributing to society. All of us have that at least a little bit inside of ourselves. And it's good to perceive that so that we don't behave in a similar manner. Okay? And so, many of the occupiers, according to my calculations, more than half of us are artists of some type or another. And I have a very interesting short little clip for us from some of the occupiers singing Break Up, Bank of America. This is fantastic. You just have to see this. Can we roll the Break Up song?
Break up, B of A, break up. Break up, B of A, break up. You thought your bubble was hot. When it popped, it hurt us a lot. We bailed you out, then we got screwed. Now we're gonna let you rot. Break up, B of A, break up, B of A. Well, we've already paid through the nose. Now you say you're gonna foreclose. But we've seen through the lies and we've organized, and we're not gonna go. Break up, B of A, break up, B of A. Well, give us principal reduction now, or we'll have mortgage strikes all over town. Break up, B of A, break up, B of A. We're taking you down.
Are you able to perceive that the 1% think that they own this planet, they own the earth and everything in it, all the natural resources? They take the resources and they sell it to us, and they don't recompense even people who work for it. They just exploit, because they really think that they own us, they own the planet and everything in it. Are you beginning to perceive how they are a group of people very imbalanced? And one of the ways in which they enslave us is through the use of usury, that is, exorbitant interest rates, which has always been seen as something immoral throughout civilization. Usury is a very nasty way of enslaving and tricking your fellow human being. And so we've got to stop complying with an immoral economic process, because we don't want to live in an immoral structure. And this destroys the soul of society, to be in such heavy debt to these bankers. So we need to cut with this. Not only because it's immoral, but because it's destructive to society. And so we need to, this is the way in which they enslave us. So please, no longer recognize the use of this highly immoral practice of usury. It's totally unethical. And to occupy means to take back what is rightfully yours, that the 1% have stolen from you. So go ahead and with all fortitude, occupy and see.